Welcome back to the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan De Silva. On this week's episode, it's all about Stan Kenton, his biography and best hits. During this summer, we're going to be talking about some of his best albums of all time. Here's a quick recap of what's coming up. We start off with Cuban Fire from 1956, a blazing fusion of Latin rhythm and big band brass. Imagine the pulse of Havana, Afro-Cuban percussion, and Kenton's orchestration roaring in sync. Then rewind to 1955 for new concepts of artistry and rhythm, bold, dramatic, and way ahead of its time. The tracks in this album redefine what a jazz orchestra can do. By 1962, Kenton drops Adventures in Jazz, a high-energy ride of rhythm and sophistication. Critics call it his creative peak. And don't miss the romantic approach, Kenton's tender side, lush with emotion and elegance. From heart to heart, Stan Kenton proved that jazz could be both powerful and poetic. That was Patrice Rushen with Arrival, Lithium Project with Absorber, Michael Lington with City Life, Larry Carlton with Buddy, Metro Area with Strut, and Stan Kenton with Painted Rhythm. Welcome back to the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan De Silva. On this week's episode, it's about Stan Kenton, his biography and best hits. During this summer, we're going to be talking about some of his best albums. Now, if there was one thing that Stan Kenton did better than anybody else, it was pushing jazz into uncharted territory. Across his long career, Kenton refused to stand still, always evolving, always experimenting. So we're going to be talking about 5 albums that showcase that fearless spirit. Cuban Fire, released in 1956, New Concepts of Artistry in Rhythm, 1955, Adventures in Jazz, 1962, The Romantic Approach, released in 1955, and West Side Story, released in 1960. Each one captures a different side of his musical genius. Let's start off with one of the most dynamic records of Kenton's career, Cuban Fire. Released in 1956, this album saw Kenton taking a daring leap into Latin jazz. Picture the heat and rhythm of Havana, the pulse of Afro-Cuban percussion, and then layer that with Kenton's signature brass-heavy orchestration. The result, a sound that's larger than life. Tracks like Cuban Carnival and Incidental Rumba are pure fire, dynamic, percussive, and full of energy. The percussion section drives rhythm with complex syncopation, while the brass blazes above it all in bold cinematic lines. Kenton doesn't just borrow Latin influences, he fuses them completely into his big band format, creating something both authentic and forward-thinking. What's truly fascinating is how Cuban Fire influenced an entire generation of jazz musicians and arrangers. It set a new bar for how Latin music could live within the jazz tradition, long before Afro-Cuban jazz became a familiar label. Each track keeps the momentum alive, with amazing crescendos and orchestral precision. You can almost close your eyes and see the lights, the movement, and the spirit of Havana itself. Now let's rewind a bit to 1955 with New Concepts of Artistry in Rhythm. This album shows Kenton in full experimental mode, revisiting some of his early ideas but giving them a bolder, more sophisticated twist. It's less about nostalgia, more about evolution. Many of the tracks are dynamic brass fanfares layered over intricate harmonies and shifting rhythms. It's as if Kenton took his original artistry in rhythm philosophy and said, alright, let's take this further. You hear echoes of his early swing roots, but they are surrounded by new textures and structures that lean towards classical complexity. What's most impressive here is the dynamic range, moments of thunderous brass power giving way to delicate woodwinds and intimate solos. Kenton understood how to make contrast work for emotional effect. New Concepts bridges his early progressive jazz sound with his later more Latin-infused and contemporary explorations. Moving forward in 1962, we find Kenton at the height of his creative maturity with Adventures in Jazz. This album perfectly captures his dual nature, the showman and the architect. It's confident, complex, and full of color. Tracks like Artistry in Percussion and the title track Adventures in Jazz demonstrate the orchestra's incredible discipline and versatility. You've got this thrilling mix of rhythmic drive, progressive harmony, impeccable ensemble work. The brass soars, the percussion snaps, and the entire thing feels alive and evolving in real time. Kenton's collaborations with top arrangers and composers during this period, people like Gene Roland and Bill Holman, added even more depth to his music. Critics praised Adventures in Jazz for how seamless it merged bold innovation with traditional jazz values. There's sophistication in the writing, but also playfulness and spirit of discovery that makes the record endlessly engaging. Every track feels like a conversation between power and precision, between structure and spontaneity. It's Kenton saying, jazz isn't just music, it's an adventure. The Romantic Approach was released in 1955. This album shows Kenton in a completely different light. Forget the roaring brass and thunderous percussion. This is the softer, more lyrical Kenton. On tracks like Loverman and Laura, the arrangements are tender and lush. The brass is smoother, the woodwinds warmer, and the pacing slower, creating a dreamy romantic atmosphere. It's not about spectacle, it's about emotion. You can hear every subtle shift in tone. What makes this album special is how it bridges two worlds, the sophistication of progressive jazz and the intimacy of balladry. It's Kenton proving that power and tenderness can coexist within the same musical vision. And you're tuned into the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan De Silva. On this week's episode, it's about the biography and best hits of Stan Kenton. Now it's time for some trending album news. This one's turning the jazz world into a musical treasure map. Grammy-winning trumpeter Charlie Porter is back with his brand new album Cypher, and he's taking listeners on an actual treasure hunt worth $10,000. That's right, hidden inside the album's 8 tracks are 9 encrypted musical clues. Decode them and you could uncover the path to real-world treasure. But Cypher isn't just a game, it's classic Charlie Porter, deep, detailed and brilliantly composed. He mingles classical and jazz traditions, crafting tracks that challenge you while still hitting you right in the soul. Featuring a top-tier lineup, Nicky Bielo on alto sax, George Colligan on piano, Garrett Baxter on bass, and Alan Jones on drums. This album is a mix of post-pop energy and intellectual intrigue. So if you think you've got sharp ears and a curious mind, Porter is inviting you to listen, decode and discover. Cypher is out now on all major digital platforms and a limited edition physical release. And to join the hunt, check out cypheralbum.com. And that was some trending music news on the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. We're going for a short break, we'll be right back after that. When we come back, we're going to be talking about more of Stan Kenton's best albums of all time. Welcome back to the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. On this week's episode, it's about Stan Kenton, his biography and best hits. During this hour, we're going to be talking about more of his best albums. Here's a quick recap of what's coming up. Let's start things off with City of Glass from 1973, one of Kenton's boldest and most futuristic projects. Think shimmering brass, shifting rhythms and cinematic soundscapes. It's not just jazz, it's architecture in sound. Now rewind to 1967 with The World We Know. Kenton takes pop hits like Sunny and This Guy's in Love with You and turns them into lush orchestral jazz statements. It's smooth, sophisticated and full of swing. Then there's Kenton Wagner from 64, a jaw-dropper. Wagner's Ride of the Valkyries reimagined for a roaring jazz orchestra. Classical meets brass thunder. And to wrap it up, Hair from 1969. Kenton's groovy take on a rock musical. Aquarius, Let the Sunshine In, pure energy, pure Kenton. And that was a quick insight into what's coming up during this hour, and you're tuned into the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. Welcome back to the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. On this week's episode, it's about Stan Kenton, his biography and best hits. During this hour, we're going to be talking about more of his best albums. Each one shows how Kenton kept evolving, always reaching for something new, even decades into his career. Released in 1973, City of Glass marks one of the most adventurous chapters in Kenton's career. By this point, jazz had changed. Fusion and modal orchestral jazz were taking shape, yet Kenton managed to stay right in step, even ahead of the curve. The title track, City of Glass, is a soundscape in itself. It's filled with shimmering brass, intricate woodwinds, and rhythmic structures that shift like reflections of windows. Kenton and his arrangers created a piece that feels both futuristic and cinematic. Then there's Gentle Rain, a total contrast. Where the title track is sharp and angular, the Gentle Rain unfolds like a watercolor. You can hear Kenton's maturity as a band leader, the way he balances the technical with the emotional. It's the sound of an artist who, even in the 1970s, refused to look backward. City of Glass is proof that Kenton never stopped experimenting. He pushed his orchestra to the limits of what big band jazz could express, blending classical complexity, modern dissonance, and an unmistakable Kenton grandeur. Moving back a few years, we find Kenton in 1967 with The World We Know. This was a time when pop and jazz were crossing paths more than ever, and Kenton jumped right into that conversation. This album takes contemporary pop hits like Sunny and This Guy's in Love with You and completely reimagines them. Instead of lightweight, easy-listening covers, Kenton turns them into lush orchestral jazz statements. The brass sings, the strings shimmer. The 60s were a challenging time for big band leaders. Rock was dominant, jazz was fragmenting. The World We Know bridges that gap beautifully. Each arrangement is full of rhythmic vitality and harmonic richness. You can hear his orchestra expanding. Strings, percussion, even some unconventional instruments, all adding fresh colors to the Kenton palette. This album wasn't just about survival in a changing era, it was about reinvention. Now let's rewind a little further to 1964 for one of Kenton's boldest projects, Kenton Wagner. Here, Kenton takes the towering works of classical composer Richard Wagner and reimagines them for a jazz orchestra. Ride of the Valkyries with a swinging thunderous brass section. The result, a sound that's both epic and electric. Wagner meets the concert hall meets a jazz club. Then in 1969, Kenton took another leap with Hair, his jazz interpretation of the hit rock musical that defined the counterculture. Now this one's pure energy. Tracks like Aquarius and Let the Sunshine In capture that late 60s optimism and turn it into a brass-full celebration. The rhythms pop, the harmonies glow, and the arrangements are bursting with creativity. What makes Hair special is how Kenton merges sophisticated orchestrations with the pulse of pop and rock. It's playful yet powerful. You can hear the orchestra having fun, stretching out, experimenting. Kenton was always tuned into the sound of his times, and this album proved that he could groove with the best of them. Hair is vibrant, forward-thinking and very Kenton, bridging the worlds of jazz, theatre and pop culture with flair and intelligence. Welcome back to the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. On this week's show, it's about the biography and best hits of Stan Kenton. We've come to an end of this week's episode of the Jazz Update, so now it's time to recap what we're discussing during this program. Stan Kenton was a pianist, composer, and big band leader who completely redefined what jazz could be. Born in Kansas in 1911, Kenton rose to fame in the 1940s with his groundbreaking progressive jazz movement, a style that mixed classical structure, bold harmonies, and the power of a full orchestra. His bands were huge, his brass sections thunderous, and his vision always forward-looking. Kenton wasn't content to stay within swing traditions. He pushed jazz into the world of art, experimentation, and modern sound. Albums like Artistry in Rhythm and Innovations in Modern Music made him a household name in the jazz world, while his passion for musical education and mentorship inspired generations to come. That was a bit of insight into his biography. Now let's talk about some of his best albums. Let's start our recap with one of his later triumphs, City of Glass from 1973. This album was a bold step into the future, a breathtaking blend of jazz and orchestral textures. The title track builds like a city skyline, full of shimmering brass, angular rhythms, and bold harmonies that seem to dance and reflect light. Then there's The Gentle Rain, a track that balances all that intensity with warmth and emotional depth. It's Kenton at his most mature, blending sophistication with heart. Even after decades in the business, he proved that creativity never fades. Next, let's move to 1967's The World We Know. This was Kenton stepping confidently in the era of pop and modern jazz. Taking songs like Sunny and This Guy's in Love with You, he reimagined them as lush orchestral jazz pieces. The arrangements are full of color, sweeping strings, bold brass, and rhythmic precision that make familiar tunes sound completely new. In 1964, Kenton took one of his most daring creative leaps with Kenton Wagner. Here, he reinterpreted Wagner's monumental classical works, pieces like The Ride of the Valkyries and Siegfried's Funeral March, through the lens of jazz. The result was nothing short of epic. His orchestra rose with brass energy, and the woodwinds weave in and out like a full symphony. It's dramatic, it's commanding, and it proved that jazz could be as grand and complex as any classical masterpiece. Then came 1969's Hair, Kenton's take on the rock musical that defined a generation. This album captures that free-spirited late 60s vibe, full of groove, rhythm, and optimism. Tracks like Aquarius and Let the Sun Shine In radiate energy, with Kenton's big band giving those pop anthems a jazzy, sophisticated twist. It's lively, colorful, and filled with the kind of inventive arrangements only Kenton could deliver. With Hair, he showed the world that even jazz's most serious minds could have a little fun. And finally, West Side Story from 1960, one of his most celebrated recordings. Here, Kenton takes Leonard Bernstein's iconic Broadway hit and transforms it into a thrilling jazz spectacle. Songs like America and Maria come alive with dazzling brass, rhythmic drive, and rich harmonies that elevate the emotion of the originals. The result, a larger-than-life experience that bridges musical theatre and jazz in a way that no one else had done before. It's theatrical, it's intense, and it remains one of Kenton's defining works. And that was a quick recap of everything that we discussed on this week's episode of the Weekend Jazz Update with Yashani Silva. And that brings me to an end of this week's program. You can check out the archives of today's show on my YouTube channel, The Weekend Jazz Update with Yashan. I'll see you again next week. Have a great week ahead.